Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. We're going to make something special today. My mom's coming for dinner. We're having beef stew, and I want to have from my mother some nice hot yeast bread. This is Julia Child's recipe, which I've not made for you before. It's a little special. It's a little different. So here are the ingredients. Write them down, and let's get cooking. I have to tell you guys first, I have a little stuffy nose this morning, so bear with me if I sound like I'm whining. I'm really not. This is a KitchenAid Pro mixer. You do not have to have a fancy mixer to make good bread. I use the mixer to knead, but you can do it by hand. I just can't do it by hand anymore because it hurts my hands. So we're going to start out with the mixer, and Julia's recipe shows it both ways. Here are the ingredients. I have 2.5 cups water, and this is tap water, and I have a thermometer in here. For yeast bread, you want your temperature to be between 105 and 115. This is 115 right now. It'll cool down a little bit as I go. Then I have my flour. You can use bread flour or all-purpose flour. You're going to use about 7 cups. And that may vary based on the humidity, the weather, the atmospheric pressure. It's going to be about 7 cups. And either bread flour or all-purpose will work. This is instant yeast, and you can see I have the package in a glass lock container because I keep it refrigerated. I buy it in a large quantity, and I split it up, and half is refrigerated and half is in the freezer. You can use active dry yeast, but having good fresh yeast is the number one factor in whether or not your bread turns out well. Then I have sugar. We're only going to use a tablespoonful of sugar, and that sugar is just to feed the yeast. Little hint here, if you use instant yeast, you can leave the sugar out. And then I have a stick of softened butter. It's not really soft yet, but by the time I need it, it will be. If not, I'll pop it in the microwave for about 15 seconds. The butter is the difference. We also need 1 tablespoonful of salt that I'll add at the end. So as with most bread recipes, we're going to start by proofing the yeast. If you use instant yeast, you don't actually have to proof it, but there's no reason not to. It doesn't hurt anything, and it's always good to check and make sure that your yeast is nice and fresh and active. So I put about 1/2 cup water into my mixer bowl, and then I'm going to add the tablespoonful of yeast, and then I'm going to add the tablespoonful of sugar. And as I said, you don't actually have to use the sugar if you're using instant yeast, but you might as well, and it adds just a little bit of flavor. But the sugar is to feed the yeast and get it to start working, and to get it to be strong before you add the ingredients. So we're going to add this tablespoonful of sugar. And then I'm just going to stir that up. Now we're going to give this a chance to begin its work. So many people tell me they have trouble making yeast bread, and check this step if you're having trouble. You always want to check your yeast. Over the years, I have found that yeast you buy in the grocery store is often not very strong, and if it's not, then you're not going to have good bread. So we're just going to mix this up, get all the little knots out of it. And then I will let this sit for 5 minutes, at least 5 minutes, and you'll know after 5 minutes whether or not you're working with good yeast. We'll be back. And here we go. I want to show you what I mean by foamy. It's making bread is really a form of fermentation. So you want to let this get started before you start adding your flour and stuff to it. So see that nice foam? And you might not have quite that much foam if you're using active dry instead of instant, but that gives you an idea of what you're looking for. So we have nice, fresh, good yeast here. So we're going to have nice, fresh, good bread. Now I'm adding the rest of the water. It's right at 105 degrees. And then we're going to add the flour. At this point, we're going to add about half the flour. I'm going to put 3½ cups in and let that start the mixing. And I guess, well, I should show you how the sort of universal way to measure flour. Hold on. So we don't want this flour to be packed really tightly. And so I'm going to spoon it into my cup with a spoon until it's overflowing. And then I'll level it off with a knife, and that wouldn't make the back side of a knife, the straight side, and that wouldn't make a whole lot of difference. But when the recipe was written, the person who wrote it most likely measured the flour this way. And while the amount of flour in your bread is going to vary based on a lot of different conditions in your kitchen, the humidity, the atmospheric pressure, you want to start out with a universal measurement. So now that's 3 cups, and then we'll go about a ½ cup here. I'm going to shake it up and make sure it's kind of loose, and that's the ½ cup. So we've got 3½ cups flour to start. So let's get the dough hook in here as I clumsily manipulate it. And let me just throw in here for a second, if you're an experienced baker, a lot of the little details that I say probably seem simple to you and unnecessary, but I have lots of folks that watch these videos that are learning to cook. And sometimes these little things that experienced people just gloss over, they're really important to new cooks. So I'm going to put this on about 2 right now. I'll let it get started mixing. And as it starts to come together, I'll add another 3 cups of flour, one at a time, kind of slowly, to help pull it in. This recipe makes 2 loaves, so this is going to be a lot of dough in here. So we'll take it slow and easy. We will let it mix as we go. And just so you know, I have one of those things that covers the bowl so that you can add stuff without it splattering, but I end up knocking it off. So, you know, I'll just let the flour fly as need be, and then I'll sweep and mop afterwards. So here we go. I'm going to start adding the flour. We're going to add 3 cups, a little bit at a time. My speed's on 2, and we're going to slowly incorporate the additional flour in. And really, don't rush this. It may take a little bit more time right now, but in the long run, it'll be quicker if you give the mixer a chance to incorporate everything in kind of slowly. Okay, this is my last cup. And this next step, there's just going to be some waiting and watching. Our goal here is to have the dough hook pick up all the flour. And it may not have quite enough flour to pull it cleanly from the bowl, and if it doesn't, we'll add just a little bit more flour, and at some point I'll take a spatula and kind of knock it down from the sides to give it a little bit of help. And this step may take 5 minutes, still on speed 2, because we're just slowly incorporating it in. And I'm sure I'm going to have to add a little bit more flour here, because you see how it's staying at the bottom? We don't want it to stay at the bottom like that. We want it to all come up. So I'll add a little bit more flour here in a second. Right now I'm going to add my tablespoonful of salt. And you add the salt toward the end in, I guess, all bread recipes. You want to make sure that the gluten is forming and that the yeast is growing before you add the salt, because too much salt will kill the yeast. The salt will sort of knock back the growth a little bit and slow it down. So you add your salt toward the end. And I'm watching this and I know I've got to add a little bit more flour, and I'll do that by spoonfuls because I want to get it just to the point where everything pulls together. And I've turned my speed up just a notch, so I'm just going to add this like a heaping tablespoonful at a time, and you can see immediately it starts to pull together. You've got to have this dough thick enough, dense enough so that you can handle it, but you don't want it to be too thick and dense. So that's why this last half cup of flour, if you notice we've only used 6.5 cups so far, this last half cup I'm adding just a little bit at a time, and I find I have to turn my speed up 1 or 2 notches. Okay, we're getting there. Let me add this one. I think that's going to be enough. Can you see now how it's pulling loose? It's getting thick. It's all coming up on the dough hook. I think I'm going to have to give it just a little bit of help. I may need to adjust the depth of my dough hook. But let me pull some of this loose so that the dough can pull the flour into itself, and so that it pulls cleanly from the bottom. And that's when we know that we're ready to start kneading. So see, I pulled it loose. Now you see the difference. You see how it's coming clean from the bottom. That's what you're looking for. That's when you stop adding flour. That's when your dough is ready to begin the timed kneading. Now I generally put this on about 3 for kneading. It calls for 2. I generally put it on about 3 just to give it a little more oomph. So this recipe calls for kneading for 10 minutes. I set the timer for 8 just because I want to show you how to check. You've got to knead it enough, but you don't want to knead it too much because it'll get thick and hard to handle. So I've oiled my fingers, and we're going to do the window pane test. You just pinch off some, kind of flatten it out. And our goal here is to have a dough that will pull thin enough to see through without tearing. And I never know what you can see on a video, but we want to pull it so that you can see light through it without it tearing. And you see there, it tore. And this was only at 8 minutes. So we're going to do our full 10 minutes of kneading. Here, I'll show you one more time. You want to try to pull it thin enough that you can see through it like a window pane without it tearing. And we're almost there, but we're not quite there. So back in 2 more minutes, and then we'll check again. So after the additional 2 minutes, you can see the difference in this dough. It's very elastic, very smooth. We're going to do the window pane test again. I'm oiling my fingers. And any of my bread videos, I've shown you this window pane test, but this is something that I didn't know until recently, and it really makes a difference in the final quality of your bread. So we'll pull it out, and as I say, I never know what you can see on a video, but I can see through it. There are spots where you can see through it. And that shows you, well, I mean, I tore it a little bit there where my finger was, but it's elastic enough. You can pull it easily apart enough that you can see through it. I'll hold it up and see if you can tell. But it's very thin. It'll pull very thin without tearing, and that means that our dough has kneaded enough. And I do stop about 2 minutes before just to make sure I don't over knead. So here we go. This is a really good feeling dough. And this would probably bake a really nice loaf of bread if we didn't do anything else to it. But we are not done. We're going to put the Julia Child touch on it now. And we're going to incorporate in our stick of butter. And I know a little bit about the science of baking. I don't know a whole lot about the science of baking. But something is different. There's a little added flavor from adding butter and adding it last. And this is the way Julia did it. You know, she used to say, you don't have to use real butter, but you'll be sorry if you don't. We're going to add this butter in about a tablespoonful at a time. I just cut off a little chunk and add it in. Now this takes a little while because you're going to wait for each pat of butter to be incorporated in, and you may have to help it a little bit with a spatula. But take your time, and the butter is pretty soft. Might incorporate in faster if it had been a little softer, but we're going to go with what we've got. Now as we add the butter, and this is unsalted butter and it's real butter, you'll see the consistency of the dough start to change. It's going to start pulling apart a little bit. And after I get all the butter in, we'll deal with that by adding, if we need to, just a little bit more flour. So I'll come back to you after I get all the butter incorporated in. Well, this is the last pat of butter, and I'm going to put this in, and I'm going to have to scrape it down a little bit, but see the difference in the texture of the dough. It's very loose. It's actually a little oily looking, and let's pull this all down, and we will have to add a little flour, a couple tablespoons full probably, to get our texture back, to help the bread pull all the butter in and incorporate it in. So you can really see the difference in it there. And I'm going to turn my speed up just a little bit. But now we're going to add the flour. I see one other piece of butter over there, but it's pulling it in. So kind of watch the difference as I add the flour. You want to get it back to that consistency where it's nice and smooth and all together. And I don't mean to waste your time here, but I think it's important to see it, because when you're making your own bread, you're going to have to make a judgment as to how much flour to add. And so you want to see what you're looking for. But this is all pulling together again. Maybe one more tablespoonful of flour. And I think that's going to be it. I'm going to let this knead for about 2 minutes, no more than that, just enough to make sure the last flour and all the little butter bits are incorporated in, and then we'll come back for the next step. Okay, we're all done now. I'm taking my dough hook out. The directions actually say now to turn this out onto a floured board, but I'm just going to take it out and put it directly into my bowl. And note to self, next time make sure you get your wipe rag out of the picture. Y'all just excuse that. That's my old dirty one. I usually try to put a nice clean one in when I'm making a video for you. See, it's all holy. But that's okay. So I have here my proofing bowl, and I don't use anything. I don't use it for anything except proofing bread. It's nice and big, and I use it because I don't like to use plastic film unless I just have to. Let's oil it really, really well. You don't want it to puddle, but any place the bread might touch should be oiled. And I'm gonna grab my dough. Oh, here's the lid. You gotta oil the underside of the lid too, because it'll touch. When it rises, it may touch the top, and you don't want it to stick to that either. I got this at the dollar store. I think I paid $3 for it. I'm not sure. And I use it every time I make bread. So let's turn this out. I'm just going to do it in my hands. You can turn it out onto your cutting board or your counter, whatever you want. Here, let me grab hold of this. So see, it stays together really nicely. It's a nice big ball of dough because this is going to be 2 loaves. And you just form it into a ball, and then we're going to put it down into the pan, into the proofing bowl. And by the way, I failed to show you that you put it in first and turn it over to get oil on all sides. I didn't get that on camera. I had to go back and do it. I sometimes forget things. So we're just going to put it in here, and we're going to let it rise for about 45 minutes. I put the lid on. I only close 2 sides because I want to leave a little opening for the air to escape. You know, as I said, making bread is actually a form of fermentation. So it's going to make gas. It's going to off gas as it's rising, and you want that to be able to escape. You can do this with plastic wrap. You want to oil the underside of the plastic wrap. I don't recommend a tea towel. A lot of people use a tea towel. To me, I've never done it with a tea towel that it didn't stick and make my bread deflate. So this is going to take about 45 minutes. My kitchen's at about 75 degrees. I'll be back. And it's been exactly 45 minutes. So let me show you what we've got here. And you want to move it kind of gently. You don't want to deflate it in case it's not quite ready. But the way you check it is stick a finger in. If the dough rushes back in to fill the hole, it needs to rise some more. You can't see it, but it's filling up from the bottom slowly, and maybe a little bit too slowly. I probably could have gone with 40 minutes of rising, but that's about right. And we're going to take the next step now. So I have a little silicone pad here. You can do this right on your counter. I have a ceramic counter, so it makes a pattern if I don't put something between the bread and the counter. So we're going to flour this really, really well because we don't want it to stick, even though it really almost can't stick to this silicone pad. I have cast iron bread pans. They're not exactly the same size, so I'll show you how I accommodate that. But I love baking the bread in the cast iron. It makes a nice browning all the way around. So we're going to just dump this out on the pad. See, it's a pretty good size piece of dough here. Now, you always see about punching down in a recipe. In case you ever wondered what that meant, it actually means punch it down. What we're doing now is we're releasing the air bubbles and really work it pretty well. And it may bubble up as you're going. If you see any bubbles, deflate them. Every bubble that you leave in this is going to be a hole in your bread. So it doesn't need kneading. It just needs punching down and releasing the air. And then I'm going to fold this into sort of a really rough rectangle. And you can use a kitchen scale if you want to make sure that you cut this in half and that you have even loaves. But as I said, my bread pans are not the same. So I sort of adjust, make one a little bit smaller than the other, and I cut a little off and make a couple of rolls with the extra dough. If you have 2 bread pans, standard loaf pans the same size, that won't be an issue for you. You can use a scale. I use a scale when I'm making a challah bread because you want to have equal parts. You know, you have 6 braids in a challah loaf. And I have a video for that if you want to make a fancy braided loaf of bread. But I'm just going to eyeball this one because I've actually done it before and can kind of eyeball. One's a little bit bigger than the other. And we're just going to work it now into a sort of a rectangle. And we're going to do what's called the letter fold. You can roll it, but Julia does the letter fold, and I'm trying to do it the way she does. Or the way she did. I sometimes forget that she's gone. So I'm going to flour up my rolling pin here, and you see I've got this formed into a rectangle. And I set my pan right there because I want to eyeball it. I want this dough to be the same width as my pan and longer. And it doesn't have to be exactly any particular length, but you want it to be close to the same width as your bread pan. And as you go, you may have bubbles come up. You want to punch out those bubbles, roll them down. Sometimes according to the warmth in the kitchen, you can hear it pop as you roll, and that's fine. So the letter fold, get this kind of straight, and as I say, you could roll it. A lot of recipes call for you to roll it like that, but we're going to do the letter fold, and that's just a 3-fold, just like you were folding a letter to go in an envelope. Press it out, and you can handle this a lot. It's not tender. It's a nice elastic dough. And then just fold it a third and pat it down, and a third and pat it down. Now we're going to pinch the fold, and even though that looks a little rough, that's going to come out as it rises. And you do this because if you don't pinch it, the bread could separate as it's rising and cooking. And we want a nice solid loaf. Pinch it all the way across. To make sure it adheres. And I flip it over and put it into my oiled pan. And you want to oil it thoroughly, but you don't want it to be puddled. Sort of press it down in a little bit. And now we'll do the next one. And I'll be back. And now the dreaded plastic wrap. I usually have those little things you call shower caps with the plastic with elastic around them, and put that over there. But I don't have any the right size right now, so I'm going to struggle with this plastic wrap. We want to cover this loosely, so we'll pull out some plastic wrap, and I'm going to oil the back side of it, the side that touches the bread. And I don't make it tight. I just put it over it and kind of make it loose, because you want to give the bread room to rise. And I'll say again, when I first tried to make bread all those many years ago, everybody used a damp tea towel. And it dries, and then it sticks to the bread, and I just never use a tea towel, even though I still see some folks do it. You can use plastic wrap. You can use the little shower cap things. That's what my mother calls them, so that's what I call them. But we're just going to loosely cover it, and then I'll set these over in my warm spot on my stove and let them rise until they start to crest. And this is what I mean by cresting. It's just up above. The other one's not quite the same, but it's okay. So to check it, you make a small indentation very gently. If it stays indented, then it's ready to bake. Preheated 375, it'll take 35 to 45 minutes. This is 40 minutes on my stove, and that wide leeway, I'm going to show you how to check. You'll have to learn your oven. 30 minutes is not enough in my oven. It's gummy in the middle. So we check the temperature. When you have enriched breads enriched with either eggs or butter, you want your internal temperature to be right at 200. And if you'll see, we're right at 200. So this bread is ready to go. We'll turn it out. I'll show you what we got. So you want to turn this out on a cooling rack. And I'm sorry, I'm working around the camera here, so I'm a little clumsy. Let's just dump that one out. And it sounds kind of hollow, by the way. And some people check it by the hollow sound. I found the thermometer is much better. And excuse my cord there. If I didn't have my light, you couldn't see, and that means there's a cord. So I think I'm going to butter this a little bit. This is not too shabby. You can see the difference in my pan sizes there. And I also made a couple of little rolls to go along with it with the dough that I cut off. Looks pretty good. Let's butter it. And now the hard part. You have to wait an hour before you cut this. And really, you have to wait an hour before you cut it, because it'll just deflate. It won't be good. So we're going to get us a little butter. Yep, there's my mother putting the 2 little rolls there, the little extra. She's going to butter those. And you know, it made me feel really good. My mother ate both of those rolls. And I made them for her, so that's a good thing. We'll come back when it's time to cut. So we've been good. It's been an hour. I've got out my little slicer here that my friends in the cooking porch gave me as a gift because I didn't have one. So let's slice this, and I'm going to show you this wonderful texture. There really is something different about this bread. The taste is a little different because of the butter added at the end. The texture is so nice and moist. And I'm going to put me just a little bit of butter on this because, you know, you have to test it. And I was good. I waited an hour. May have to get more butter. So there you go, just a little bit of butter. And for me, bread is perfect if it's just a little, if it gives you just a little resistance to the teeth. And this is just perfect. Thank you, Julia. And thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you. Hope to see you again tomorrow.